Our last speaker slash icebreaker, and that's Dr. Robert Farnan, and who is a research associate at the Stockholm Environmental Institute at the University of York. He is an international political sociologist working at the nexus of development studies and human geography. His research explores the intersection of security, conflict, and development, with particular focus on environmental governance, urban resilience, and the technopolitics of infrastructure in South and Southeast Asia. Relevant publications include infrastructural violence, logistical governance, and practices of transparency along the East-West Economic Corridor, Thailand and Myanmar, which was published by the Thailand Research Fund in 2018, and Urban Resilience and the Neoliberal Subject of Climate Change in Thailand, which came out in the Asian Review in 2017. Prior to joining the Stockholm Environmental Institute, he worked at Chiang Mai University. He holds a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And if I'm not, if I say this incorrectly, Robert, you've also worked in Nepal, including parts of Southeast Asia, which are highlighted here. Thailand and Myanmar. Quite a bit of your work is also centered on Nepal. So with that, over on to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Nasheen, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't make the first couple of days sessions. I guess I have about 5 minutes, right? So what I'll try to do here is I'll kind of give a presentation of maybe 4 broad themes that I think are applicable for our discussion, and then a couple really brief comments to each of the presenters. So the first theme that I'd like to draw in relation to securitization, COVID, climate change, and urbanization more generally is the question of subjectivity. So I think a lot of the presenters here talk about subjectivity, and I think it's something that we need to have a greater recognition. So of the lived experience, for example, social context, power relations, and indeed the categorizations of people within different urban contexts. So this includes also new and old residents of informal settlements, as well as broader social, cultural, political categories. I think it's the recognition of subjectivity that helps determine how social and economic entitlements, for example, get distributed. So as I said, these could be grounded in an individual's cultural, racial, ethnic, gender attributes, and these will have effects on how, for example, resilience might be differentiated and experienced differently, and how people mobilize these attributes, maybe as a kind of strategic essentialism, if you like. So I'm here kind of putting forward an idea that we do need to look at the social construction of how urban vulnerability and risk is distributed across urban space. So obviously subjectivities here shape how people interpret what is happening around them. You can see them as, or understand them as kind of pre-existing mental modes for how people interact in the world. So that would be the first kind of theme that I think cuts across each of the presenters, and hopefully has some import for the previous 2 days as well. The second theme would be about inclusion, participation, and its relation to representation. So one of the things I think we're all trying to get at here is that there's benefit for greater inclusion in decision making, right? So one thing I think that we need to consider here is how inclusion is formed, and its relation to obviously processes of exclusion and to difference, and how within frameworks of exclusion you have divergent capacities and capabilities. One of the things that I think is quite important to link in relation to inclusion or exclusion is discourse or representation, narrative, norms, and different forms of knowledge, and how this impacts in both informal and formal governing arrangements at different scales across society and across communities. So here, inclusion in participatory processes, I think, requires that we have, at a really fundamental level, a greater consideration of social identities. And I'll touch upon how this might play out in terms of some of the presenters who just spoke. Because I think social identities invariably, in both formal and informal settings, influence resource allocation and how people form relationships with authority and with their own environment. Inclusion of different discourses and knowledges therefore allows us to recognize different values, take them seriously, and see how interests are embedded in particular forms of decision-making. The third theme that I'd like to draw out is scale, right, or the question of scale. And I think a greater appreciation of scale, both at a geographic level and also temporally, is quite crucial for understanding how environmental governance arrangements operate. So scale here, I think, is bound up with processes of marginalization, right? It can limit how people are able to participate in decision-making between local, municipal, national scales, for example. So I think it's important that we understand the cross-scale interactions, right? Bring those to the fore explicitly. For example, with some of the kind of early work I've been doing in Nepal, we can see that increases in resilience at one scale may cause vulnerabilities at another scale and preclude participation for certain groups of people. So this is a question of incredible complexity. Cross-scale collaboration requires, I think, some creativity in terms of what theoretical lenses we use, and I'd be happy to kind of open that discussion and talk about how we can think about scale as something that is transversal, right, that moves beyond existing political, social, cultural boundaries. And that, I think, those three themes perhaps link to the last theme or general point I'd like to raise before I talk about the presenters, is that one of transformation. And something I think that we've all talked about is how we can kind of leverage this knowledge, these insights towards thinking about social transformation, perhaps in a more inclusive way. And speaking from kind of a resilience background or a critical approach to resilience, I think transformation might be a better lens for us to think beyond merely adaptation, right? So to think beyond adaptation to vulnerabilities, to the societal transformation that might indeed bring about long-lasting forms of equality and sustainability. So here is looking at, in bringing up transformation here, I think we're highlighting the inherently political aspect of all of this, which Nasheen, you mentioned at the very beginning when you introduced our discussion. Just two brief insight or two ideas that might be important methodologically speaking is about thinking about learning systems or social learning platforms that are inclusive and touch upon notions of participatory democracy, perhaps, in which those who are included in policy, or those who are targeted for policymaking, are included in those processes and actually listened to, rather than kind of being subservient to those decision-making processes. So those are kind of four general themes that I kind of wanted to raise. In regards to the three excellent and very interesting presentations, I just have a couple comments for and questions maybe for Nirmani. I think the two focuses on piecemeal planning, or the two observations, one on piecemeal planning and the second on the lack of participation, lends itself to looking at how local networks and partners are bound up in these broader discourses around urban risk and vulnerability. And yeah, so relate quite well to kind of some of those themes I touched upon earlier. So I'd be interested to see how, what kind of narratives are actually being put forth in the Sri Lankan context there. For Miraz's presentation, let me see. I agree with Nasheen. I like the idea of reactive violence and the infodemic, insofar as it helps us look at violence in a much more broad way, right? So we can think of narratives and discourses as forms of, as representational violence. For the infodemic angle, I would also like to suggest that with your suggestion of in highlighting the kind of infodemic, one of the things that's quite interesting is that I think it reveals that often what you see in policymaking is that the solution is to create more information, right? It's a quite linear policymaking notion that if you have a problem, more information, greater resource will solve it and bring about greater inclusion. I think one of the questions here to raise is whether this is actually the case, and whether what we do need to look at instead is the process or the practices by which information is disseminated. So the broader context through which information becomes publicly available, rather than simply thinking about it being a deficit or a type of lack. So I think I'm probably running out of time here, but Adnan, my last bunch of comments would relate to your very interesting articulation of how public health is becoming securitized, right? And I would be interested to hear a little bit about how this national security framework is bound up within broader discourses, perhaps about Pakistani identity, and how that plays out within the national security domain and policymaking. So those are some just kind of really brief initial thoughts from the presenters, and I'm very happy to continue this discussion. Thank you.